Welcome to True Crime Deep Dive. I am your host, Sherry.
I'm your host, Mark.
Let's dive into it. Okay, so today we're diving into a case that's pretty disturbing, to say the least. We're talking about Luis Garavito, the Beast, Goofy, those names.
Yeah.
The guy who, his crimes are just horrific.
Yeah, no easy way around it, right? This is one of those deep dives that it's tough, definitely tough, but important, I think.
Yeah.
We're basing this mainly on this one really detailed article, go through his whole life, what he did, how they finally caught him. And look, we're not here for the shock value. We want to break this whole thing down. What made him tick, as messed up as it was, the sheer scale of it, what happened afterward, all that. And of course, got to be sensitive to the victims, the families, all the suffering involved.
Right, of course. So who was this guy? Luis Garavito. He was born in Colombia in 1957, died just last year, 2023. And it was throughout the 90s that he became infamous, sexually assaulting and murdering, countless children, young men, mostly in Colombia, but there were confirmed cases in Ecuador too. And the legal side of it, at least on paper, was huge. Sentences in Colombia and Ecuador, like hundreds, even thousands of years total. But the reality of Colombian law, he served way less.
Way less, yeah. And even that, it's hard to wrap your head around, right? The number of victims, it's just staggering. Officially, over 193 murders, 142 convictions. And then there's this later confession, if it's true, it could be 221 victims. That puts him up there with the most prolific serial killers of children ever. Just awful.
Yeah.
And we know he was active from 92 to 99, but there's signs, disturbing signs, pointing to abusive behavior even before that.
Yeah.
To get a handle on this, I guess we got to start at the beginning with his early life. And, it wasn't pretty. Lots of hardship.
No, not at all. The sources paint a pretty grim picture. Neglect, his parents were always fighting, and there are allegations of physical abuse from his father. He actually described his childhood as being filled with fear and hiding from the abuse. On top of that, he was teased and bullied relentlessly at school. Academically, he struggled. He was often isolated during breaks. He even got this cruel nickname, Garabato, meaning squiggle, because of his thick glasses.
And then, tragically, his formal education ended pretty early. Around 1968, his father pulled him out of the 5th grade. He had to work, contribute to the family's finances. They were really struggling. It meant he wasn't allowed to really make friends, especially with girls, because the focus was all on earning money. And then there are these deeply disturbing allegations of sexual molestation by a family neighbor who was a pharmacist, described as a really religious guy, close to Garavito's dad. The article does mention that some experts have questioned how true these claims are.
Right. But regardless of the specifics of that, what we see after this alleged abuse, it's a change in his behavior, and it's really disturbing. The sources say he started killing birds, dissecting them. He was acting inappropriately with his younger siblings, and it's even said that he molested another child around this time. Family and people who knew him, they all described this stark change in him. He became withdrawn, intensely aggressive. One person said, and this is really chilling, ready to take revenge on the world. You have early trauma, no stable support system, and these escalating behaviors that are just so worrying. And of course, we're not excusing his actions later on, but it does give you some context, right? You see how a psyche that's already so damaged could potentially develop in such a destructive way.
Yeah, exactly. And so the family moved to Trio in 71, and it's significant that Garavito didn't say anything about this alleged abuse, not until he was arrested. He said he was afraid his family wouldn't believe him. Not long after they moved, this neighbor exposes him to pornography and then beats and sexually assaults him, just layer upon layer of trauma. And unfortunately, it doesn't end there. Through his family, he starts drinking, and by 72, he's aggressively trying to have sex with local women, but they're rejecting him.
And that's where we start seeing this pattern of behavior with children emerging. Same year, his own mother kicks him out for trying to assault a 5-year-old boy. And it happens again in 73. Another attempted assault, this time a 6-year-old at a train station in Bogota. And what's really chilling is how his father reacted. Instead of being horrified that his son's trying to assault children, Garavito said his dad actually reprimanded him for not picking a woman instead. It's a really messed up family dynamic. Eventually, he's evicted for good because of what the source calls his homosexual behavior.
But even with all this going on, he does try to hold down jobs. He works as an assistant in retail, even tries to study marketing. But he's got this really volatile temper, and his behavior gets him into trouble, so he keeps losing jobs. He works as a street vendor or migrant worker. The interesting thing is he did manage to have platonic relationships with some older women. And the article says that when he was in romantic relationships and when he was sober, he actually took care of his partner's kids like they were his own. But then when he was drinking, it was the complete opposite. Violent, jealous, controlling, verbally abusive. It led to him being isolated and getting evicted again and again. So you see these two sides to him, almost like Jekyll and Hyde.
Yeah, it's really striking. Now, as he gets into adulthood, before the murders start, the article suggests that he's really struggling mentally.
Oh, absolutely. The sources point to psychosis, paranoia, depression, and these compulsive urges. And a big one, a real fixation on pubescent boys. He also said he wanted to have a family of his own. But when he was drunk, he had erectile dysfunction with women. And that really got to him. He was really upset about it. It fueled all this resentment and anger towards his family.
And he did try to get help, at least for a while. In '78, he went to Alcoholics Anonymous, even converted to Pentecostalism. He had a relationship with his older sister, Esther, but his drinking pushed them apart, and he was fighting with his younger siblings, too. The jobs were still a problem. And after he got fired from a bakery, he actually attempted suicide.
Yeah, and the article talks about him being hospitalized multiple times for psychiatric care in the spring of 1980. He was talking about suicide, saying things like his life was worth nothing. They diagnosed him with depression, even though the article points out that he was clearly showing signs of psychosis and bulimia. They gave him antipsychotics.
It's crazy, though, because even while he's seemingly trying to get help, his behavior just gets worse and more disturbing. He gets a job at a supermarket in Armenia, and get this, during his lunch breaks, he would go and sexually assault street children, and it starts to get even more violent. He's carrying weapons now. He even removes one of his own teeth so he could bite his victims more effectively. And then after these assaults, he starts doing these really creepy things, writing his victims' names in a blue notebook, praying for them while he walks around his room naked, beating his chest, reading the Bible. And then someone gives him a book on the occult, and he gets into esotericism and Satanism. He even went to fortune tellers, though he didn't really believe in them.
And this is where things get really, really dark. He finds Mein Kampf, and he becomes obsessed with Hitler, starts drawing these twisted parallels between their lives, like their difficult childhoods, the time they spent homeless. He admired Hitler, admired the Holocaust. He even told investigators he liked the concentration camps. I mean, this fascination with someone who caused so much suffering, it's a huge red flag. On his 27th birthday in '84, he has this complete mental breakdown. They hospitalize him for 33 days. He's on antipsychotics. He's supposed to go to therapy, but they let him out on a temporary permit, and he immediately runs off to Pereira and molests 2 children. He even leaves their pictures with his sister. They identify him. He runs again and starts collecting tools that he'll later use in his collapse.
It's just one thing after another. His obsession with violence just spirals. He gets fixated on this Colombian terrorist, Campo Elias Delgado, the guy who did that mass shooting in Bogota in '86. Garavito was fascinated by the attention Delgado got and even dreamed of getting a machine gun to kill his whole family and then himself. He thought it was the ideal way to die. During this time, he's also in a relationship with a single mother, Graciela Zabaleta. He lived with her in Pereira, helping out with bills and food, but he was gone a lot. When he was there, though, he acted like a protector. Zabaleta knew he was an alcoholic, knew about his antisocial behavior.
And by this point, people in his circle, they knew he was into kids, but no one knew how bad it really was. Starting around '88, he begins keeping detailed records of his assaults, collecting trophies from his victims. He kept them in these black suitcases that he'd store at different women's houses. The article estimates that between 1980 and '92, he raped and tortured at least 200 youths. I mean, during this period, he was in psychiatric care for 5 years total, tried to kill himself several times. And wherever he lived, reports of child molestation skyrocketed. And then there's this story about him having a psychotic episode with a Ouija board. He claimed he made a pact with the devil and that he was told to kill. His first attempt at murder was in October '92. He lured a boy, wanted to take him to the woods, but something stopped him, and he ended up getting beaten by the police.
And that leads us to the murders. They start soon after that failed attempt. His first documented murder was Juan Carlos, a 13-year-old boy, on October 4th, 1992. The article goes into some pretty disturbing detail about the crime scene. He'd bought rope and a knife beforehand. He claimed that the moonlight reflecting on the river invoked some strange force, reminded him of his childhood, and just enraged him. And to avoid getting caught, he started using disguises. In Trujillo, he became known as Goofy. People thought he was this generous guy who gave kids stuff. Ironically, that made it harder to track him because people would sometimes go out of their way to help him.
For years, he kept these really detailed records of his crimes. Tickets, receipts, clothes, even ID cards from his victims. He kept it all in this black suitcase. He also collected their amputated toes, although he eventually got rid of them because he was worried about police dogs. His life at this point was just pure chaos. He was losing jobs, sometimes homeless, relying on people he knew for a place to stay. He was getting more and more erratic, aggressive, constantly fighting, getting evicted. He even planned to do a mass murder of adults. He thought it would get him on TV. Thankfully, they caught him before he could do that.
The article then describes some specific murders, just highlighting the brutality, how his methods changed over time. He'd prey on kids who were vulnerable, offering them money, promising them work. A lot of them were from poor, marginalized communities. He used brandy to get them drunk, then he tied them up, tortured them, cut off their genitals, give them terrible wounds, and sometimes he'd engage in necrophilia. And his crimes weren't just in Colombia. In the summer of '98, he murdered at least 4 boys in Ecuador. 14-year-old Bel Gustavo Lor Velez, 12-year-old Jimmy Leonardo Palacios and Shindia, both in Chone. And they found other bodies there too, with similar injuries. He even claimed he'd killed people in Venezuela. But it's important to remember not all of his victims died. The article tells the stories of a few survivors.
Yeah, absolutely. There's William Trujillo, who was abducted and tortured in 1979, but he managed to escape after 12 hours while Garavito was passed out. And then another boy, they don't name him, who was assaulted in 1988 near a place where they later found a lot of bodies. And there's Carlos Alberto, who was abducted, assaulted, and threatened in the early 90s, but he was let go. And then Bram Bernal, who was abducted and assaulted, stabbed with a screwdriver, but he also managed to get away. These accounts, they give you a glimpse into the terror those poor kids went through, but they also show how incredibly resilient they were.
So let's talk about how he operated, his modus operandi. The article breaks it down in a really chilling way. He almost always targeted kids from poor communities, marginalized communities. He'd lure them in with little gifts, money, or the promise of some odd jobs. He said he had this force inside him that made him do it. He also said he preferred boys with certain physical features, though that might just be him trying to justify his actions. He was bold. He'd operate in broad daylight in public places. He'd use disguises, a priest, a teacher, an old man, whatever he thought would work to gain their trust. And once he had their trust, he'd take them to these secluded places where he'd already scoped out for mass graves. He'd talk to them, probably to tire them out, make them feel comfortable before he did what he did. Then he'd give them alcohol, tie them up, and threaten them with a knife.
The article also mentions, again, this pact with the devil thing, how he incorporated satanic rituals into the murders. It's like he thought he was sacrificing the children. And the torture, it was just horrific. Stabbing with screwdrivers, flaying their skin with broken blades, cutting off their genitals and putting them in their mouths, beatings, burns, deep cuts. Sometimes he continued the sexual abuse even after their intestines were exposed. He'd impale them. Some of them had over 100 stab wounds. His climax, and I hate to even say that word in this context, but it often involved decapitating the child while they were still alive or cutting their throat. Sometimes he'd even put their severed genitals in their mouths. And there was necrophilia too. The bodies were always found naked, with bite marks and signs of severe sodomy. They'd find lubricant and empty brandy bottles at the crime scenes. And most of the bodies showed that they had been tortured for a long time. It's just pure evil.
It's really hard to even fathom. So with all this going on, the investigation into the disappearances, the murders, it was tough at first, tragically, because a lot of the victims were from these marginalized communities. And because of the civil war in Colombia at the time, their disappearances didn't always get the attention they deserved, at least not right away. But then they started finding these mass graves in late '98, and that's when a huge investigation got going. At first, they thought it might be a satanic cult or a child trafficking ring, but they kept finding the same evidence at different crime scenes. This specific nylon cord, certain liquor bottle caps, and that led them to think maybe it was just one guy.
Yeah, and there was this huge turning point. They found Garavito himself, passed out on top of a child's body. He was naked, drunk, had a lit cigarette in his hand, and he'd even started a fire in a nearby sugarcane field. He left some crucial evidence behind by accident: his glasses, his shoes, his shorts, and a note with Graciela Zabaleta's address on it. The glasses were really important because they showed that the suspect was probably middle-aged and had astigmatism in his left eye. And his shoes, they pointed to a limp and someone about 5'4" to 5'6". They actually arrested the wrong guy at first, another sex offender. But kids were still disappearing, and suspicion started to fall on someone else. The detective in charge, he got in touch with Garavito's girlfriend. She hadn't seen him in months, but she had this black suitcase that he left behind. It was full of evidence. Pictures of young boys, journals with all the details of his murders, lists of his victims, and bills and documents that linked him to different places and identities. That's what led them to his empty house.
So they finally caught him a few days later. And it wasn't even because of the murders, it was because he tried to rape a 12-year-old boy, Johnny von Sebegal, in April '99. He told the boy he was a politician and lured him away, threatening him with a knife. But this homeless teenager heard them struggling and intervened. Both boys managed to run, and Garavito, he started asking this young girl for directions, which led the police right to him as he was coming out of the woods. He gave them a fake ID, but they already knew who he was. Later on, witnesses, surviving victims, they all identified him. And they had a ton of circumstantial evidence, too. The thing that really nailed it was his eye condition. It matched perfectly with the prescription of the glasses they'd found at the crime scenes, and then the DNA from his stuff matched the DNA on several of the victims. After they arrested him during the interrogation, he finally confessed. He admitted to about 140 of the murders, gave them all these gruesome details. They found him guilty of 138 out of the 172 counts he was facing at the time the article was written.
He got a sentence of 853 years and 9 days. Longest sentence in Colombian history. But because of Colombian law, the most he could serve was 40 years. And then, because he cooperated and helped them find the bodies, they reduced it to 22 years. It's just crazy. He went to a maximum security prison, kept away from the other inmates, obviously. And when he was up for parole in 2023, people were outraged. It was a huge deal. Thankfully, they blocked his early release because he hadn't paid the fines he owed to the victims' families. But even in prison, he was completely delusional. He said he was going to run for Congress, become a Pentecostal pastor, even get married. He said he wanted to help abused children when he got out. He also got really sick in prison. Aggressive eye cancer, leukemia, left him blind and weak. He needed blood transfusions all the time. He spent most of his time in the prison's medical unit making handicrafts. The psychiatrist diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality traits. You know, when we say antisocial personality disorder, it's not just about being a loner, it's a clinical thing. It means you constantly disregard and violate other people's rights. You have no empathy, no remorse, and that's Garavito to a T.
He died in October 2023, 66 years old. And for some people, it was like the end of a nightmare. But for others, it just brought up all the anger and criticism about his sentence. People felt like he got off easy, that his punishment didn't fit the crime. They thought he should have gotten life without parole or even the death penalty. But neither of those were options in Colombia at the time. This whole case, it really exposed a problem in Colombian law when it came to serial killers. And because of that, they increased the maximum penalty for these types of crimes. The article also mentions this interview from 2006 where Garavito actually tried to downplay what he did. He even said he wanted to go into politics. It's just unbelievable.
So we've covered a lot. The scale of Luis Garavito's crimes, the beast, it's just mind-blowing. And we've gone into the details of his motivations, his methods, all drawn from the source material. We've seen how his traumatic childhood, his increasingly disturbing behavior, it all led to these systematic, brutal murders.
And we have to remember the impact this has had on the families of his victims, on Colombian society. It's lasting. It's devastating. This whole deep dive into the life and crimes of Luis Garavito, it leaves us with some heavy questions. How do you even begin to understand something so evil? What were the societal factors, like the fact that his victims were marginalized, that maybe led to these crimes going unnoticed for so long? And what does a case like this tell us about the darkest parts of human nature? What is society's responsibility to protect the most vulnerable people from predators like him? It's a chilling case that makes you think, makes you confront the darkest parts of humanity.
New episodes are going to be released every Tuesday and Friday.
Simple but essential.
Simple but essential information for staying up to date.
Foundational piece of knowledge.
You got it. And with that knowledge, you can engage with our content on your own terms, on your own schedule.
That's the beauty of it.
That's right. So with that in mind, think about this now that you know exactly when to tune in.
Think about the future.
What burning questions do you have out there?
Yeah, what topics are you hoping we'll explore in future deep dives?
What sources are just sitting in your archives, just waiting to be unpacked?
We're ready.
Waiting to have their secrets revealed.
Send them our way.
Send them our way. We're always ready for our next dive.
Always.
Guided by your curiosity.
Yeah.
So until then, keep diving.
Happy listening.
And we'll see you soon.
See you next time.
Take care.
Bye.